Hello and welcome to Write the Docs episode 8. I am Jared Morgan, product owner and less technical writer now, but that's okay because I'm surrounded by people who do know what they're doing on the podcast here today. So joining us today, we have our regular constituents, which is Chris Ward. Hello, Chris.
Hello.
Tom Johnson. Hello, Tom.
Hello.
But we actually have today we actually have a new voice on the podcast, and it's very exciting to have with us today Beth Eighthman. How are you, Beth?
I'm doing good. Hello, everyone. Hi.
Now, Beth, tell us a little bit about yourself. This is your first time on Write the Docs podcast. So where are you from?
So I'm originally from London. I work in London now, but I live in Cambridge in the UK. And I'm a technical writer. I've done a bit of UX writing in my time as well. So at the moment, I'm doing a lot of API documentation, platform documentation. But in the past, I've done a lot of work on GUI work in software help, as well as kind of command line help. I'm just about to do a command line project, which is super exciting as well. So I'm really keen on that.
That sounds like a lot of different stuff. Very cool.
Yeah.
So we've got two main topics that we'd like to have a chat about today. The first, or one of the topics that we're going to be talking about today, is sunsetting the Stack Overflow documentation beta. So that's going to probably take up the most of the show because I think it's quite interesting. There's multifaceted parts to this whole thing that will be interesting to explore. The second part will be touching on the next web article that suggests that coders don't know how to write documentation. So before you get your pitchforks, developers, let's just sound that one out between us here, and then we'll work out what that actually means. So I think let's kick off with the big topic today, which is sunsetting Stack Overflow documentation beta. Article itself was written by, I believe, one of the product managers of Stack Overflow beta, and they decided to cease documentation on August 8th, and there was this very interesting, on meta.stackoverflow.com, which we'll put in the show notes, that explains their reasoning behind it and why they've had to sunset it. So I think we might kick off first and ask the big question: who here on the podcast today has actually done work through the documentation beta before? Show of hands. That's a big no for those listening.
Well,
from what I understood, go on, Tom.
I only contributed briefly to understand the process. I mean, I did a very small edit, and that was it.
And how did you find that whole process? Was it easy enough, or did it have blockers in the way?
There's some conceptual differences that I didn't entirely understand. Like you sort of just create a block of documentation, and I wasn't sure how it would fit in the larger flow of the other information in that topic. So, I mean, it was easy enough to just create it with the tools, but to understand how it fits into the larger scope was a little fuzzy to me. But I didn't really sink a ton of time into trying to fully understand it.
I'll be honest and say I'd never touched it. It didn't seem like something at the time as a technical writer that I would want to actually use as a service. I think there were other ways of actually contributing to documentation out there, and for me, it wasn't the right fit. So I just didn't bother having a look at it.
I think the problem.
Have you used it?
Oh yeah. So I had a look through. I never actually contributed to it. When I heard they were sunsetting it, that was kind of the first that I really came across looking at what they'd really done. And I ended up reading up through quite a lot of the meta Stack Overflow posts on how the people who'd used it, how they perceived it. And it does seem like the problem that Tom raised is a really big one in terms of you can write an individual, if you have an example in your head, that's one thing. But trying to work out how to cater for how you're going to try and be comprehensive seemed to be something they just didn't consider. Like there wasn't really any place for that. It was very much here is a bunch of information and you can contribute bunch of information, but there's no kind of higher structure to that. And I'd be interested to hear, yeah.
That's an interesting point. See, for me, I think that the idea behind Stack Overflow is there's just little chunks of information, just-in-time information that you need as a developer to go in there and work out what's going on and then leave. But as we all know, as being technical writers, it's a little bit harder to sort of structure that sort of ad hoc information to something more cohesive. So it sounds like that to me, and this is again me not having used the service, but from what you guys are telling me, that it seems that there was a big problem with, I guess, content architecture on the service. Would you say that was correct?
That was my impression, and that was also in the blog post. They talk about sunsetting, and they talk about people not being sure how to contribute to it. And I think that sounded like a similar kind of issue in terms of not being sure where to go, or yeah.
How similar did it look to the other kind of Stack Overflow workflow, which works very well for what it's designed for, but if that was how it looked for documentation, I would imagine it not working very well for that. Did it look very similar to that Q&A format?
I guess Tom would be the person. So I mostly looked in terms of how like they presented the information from I'm just trying to find some information here. It looked very similar in terms of the rankings and in terms of being able to vote on what's important. Tom, what was there's the writing workflow. I don't know if you can.
Sure. Actually, I was just going to pull up something. I think, yeah, it looks similar in the sense that you can upvote topics. So you have categories of information with little individual like forum topics similar to the other threads. And if there's information that's really important in that category, you can rise it, or you can surface it to the top. So there's kind of this flexible sort of architecture that would adapt to the interests and the demand that people want. I think that one of the main, I've been interested in crowdsourcing for a while. I used to have a role as in more of a community-oriented group, and I tried crowdsourcing and was never very successful. And I think part of the problem with crowdsourcing documentation is that documentation doesn't chunk into little easy bites like a forum thread does. Yeah. With a forum thread, you've got a single question and you've got a quick answer. And you can knock that out in 5 minutes if you know the answer. But with documentation, it's broader in scope. It could take you anywhere between 1 hour and like 10 hours to write documentation. And so that sort of task doesn't lend itself to becoming a granular little chunk that lots of different people can perform in a distributed way. As a result, like who's going to spend hours writing content when they're not getting paid for it?
I do think there was quite an interesting blog post by John Erickson, who was one of the people at Stack Overflow involved in documentation, and he was talking about why people contribute to Stack Overflow. And one of the things is that the hassle barrier is so low. You know, it's very easy. You see a question, if you know the answer, you can just answer it. Whereas with documentation, I don't know what you guys find, but I find a lot of the hard work is working out what on earth to write in the first place. If you have a question you're trying to answer, it's already easy by that point.
There was also a point people were making about the dynamics of helping a specific person with a specific question that is more appealing to developers. An actual human has this actual question, whereas documentation takes a more abstract, impersonal approach. Like nobody's asked you how to do X. You're just like suddenly gonna put on your expert hat and like, you know, expound on general topics. People didn't like that as much.
How was it structured? So did you find documentation via project or via topic, or like at the very top level? Like if I wanted to find documentation on MariaDB, how did I find it? I don't know. I'm still trying to fathom what this looked like. I mean, to be honest with you, this passed me by completely. So, so I'm interested to know how it even looks.
So the front page had tags. So there was a tag for each, you know, whether that's whatever technology or whatever thing they're doing. So I ended up looking through the Git documentation a little bit, and they had topics, but it was very much at the high level, and you would just kind of, I think it wasn't completely clear how they seeded those high level topics, and then everything within that would just be a free for all based on examples. So the examples were really the core thing they were trying to push, I think, in terms of, I think on the basis of what people want, what developers want, especially, is very much I just want the example so I can go and grab that and start getting going. But there really wasn't much structure apart from here's an example and some explanation around that.
It's kind of like if you're familiar with Reddit and you go into a forum or a sub thread, or similar to going into a tag, and you just got a bunch of different posts there. And like, for example, with MySQL, you get in here, the first one is getting started with MySQL. Another one is table creation, select, insert, JSON. And it's like just kind of without a lot of hierarchical structure. I think it sort of assumes that you have a very specific information need and you'll be attracted to that topic. You're not kind of navigating in a top-down way. So yeah, kudos to them for trying to like reinvent documentation. I mean, it's an ambitious task, and obviously, the world would benefit from a model that worked better, given how widespread kind of the animosity or antagonism is toward documentation. Definitely invite new models. But I was reading an article about why Wikipedia succeeded in contrast to other online encyclopedias.
In a small way. They're not tremendously revenue generating considering how popular they are, but they are obviously very successful in terms of page views.
Well, okay, so this scholar who was analyzing Wikipedia's success said that there were other online encyclopedias that were trying to crowdsource information, but they didn't take off, whereas Wikipedia did. And he concluded that Wikipedia didn't try to reinvent the epistemic model or whatever, the way that people are used to approaching an encyclopedia. It was fashioned after a familiar model that people were accustomed to. And some of these other online encyclopedias were trying to be too radical, too innovative, and the model just didn't quite stick with users. And I kind of think that might be part of what happened with Stack Overflow's documentation. You get in here and it's unfamiliar, it's weird, it's different. It's like, why am I going to try to navigate this new, different thing? Maybe I'll just go to the original source that has the docs in the familiar model.
That was also an interesting question they never really addressed, which was the kind of the duplication problem. There's one thing, it's one thing saying, oh, this product or this language has terrible documentation. Let's provide an alternative. But for things like, I used the example of Git. It's like, it's not like there's a lack of information out there about how to use Git.
Where do you normally end up when you're looking? But I think I was sort of starting to try to figure out if it was like to have, most people when they're searching for a specific question end up at Stack Overflow. And to sort of, instead of having these constant pages and pages of questions and answers that are all duplicates, to almost have like a canonical answer instead of various opinions. But developers are a very opinionated bunch, so I think trying to nail down one answer to one question is almost impossible anyway. And maybe, I don't know, yeah.
I do wonder if they tried to, I think what they were doing was quite ambitious, and I do wonder if they'd gone for a more simple problem, which was just trying to define a canonical answer to those questions that come up again and again, if that might have been more successful.
Maybe that could have been their iteration one. And then, from there, they could have actually gone, well, what do we do? Now we've got the actual answers sorting out properly, and we've actually removed a lot of the sort of fuzzy results from Google. Make it better.
See, it seems like... Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jared.
No, you go ahead. I was going to go on a tangent. I'm good at tangents.
Well, it seems like Stack Overflow's real sweet spot is in providing information for niche topics that don't exist in the original documentation. All those fringe cases, hard hard cases that just aren't explained. And with documentation, they just sort of veered away from that. And as Beth said, they're sort of duplicating the original material. And there's really no point.
Almost like they're rewriting the internet, right?
Yeah.
Like it feels like they're sort of rewriting the internet. Like for Git, for example, there's already great docs out there for Git, but somebody thought, you know what? I want to write my own take of Git. So I'm going to do it in documentation meta, and it's going to be great. That's fine, but rewriting the internet rarely ends well. So unless what you're writing is so different.
Sounds like you tried.
Yeah. I have in some respects. It feels like sometimes in some jobs you're at, that's all you're doing. You're basically just taking the information and changing it just enough to make it sort of relevant to your place. But, you know, I think, yeah, people were going, hey, look, this is great. I'm going to rewrite this part of Git because something about it doesn't seem right to me, so therefore I'm going to explain it differently. The thing is, they probably could have actually, thinking a little bit more laterally about it, they probably just could have gone and done a pull request on the Git, on the GitHub documentation and had a discussion that way, and then got that change into something that was better indexed and better, I guess, more canonical in nature. So, yeah, it's interesting. Tom, you were going to say something? Or Beth, I don't know who's next. I've lost track.
I mean, I was actually going to put the same question to Beth and Tom because both, to be honest with you, I read more about it in your 2 blog posts than Stack Overflow's blog posts. So I guess I was interested in hearing what prompted you to write those blog posts and your sort of opinions not expressed yet that were in them.
Go ahead, Beth.
Sure. I guess I found it really interesting just in terms of the reason I ended up writing that was because that post, it genuinely made me quite sad. You know, the sunsetting one, we're like, oh, this didn't work out, you know, and I think it was, you know, it was really nice to read that in its honesty. But sort of trying to think about what could succeed along those lines, because yeah, in theory, if we could crowdsource a bunch of, especially the keeping things up to date, which is always the least pleasant part of my job, like the things that, you know, allow people to contribute in a way that they think is valuable, but also that takes advantage of the power of the crowd, I guess. Like that was something that could have been incredibly valuable, and it's a real shame that we didn't get to see that.
Yeah.
From my point of view, what
Mm-hmm.
prompted me to write that post was it's a significant event in TechCom. You know, it's not something that happens every decade even. So it was worth kind of exploring. At the same time, what my main takeaway, and I stated this in my little post on this, and somebody called me out and said, you know, my assumptions are kind of flaky. But I think it provides a pretty substantial argument that crowdsourcing documentation on the web is a effort that pretty much fails always. Like if they couldn't do it, who can? And you know, it could be argued that they actually did have a lot of content there. They had a lot of contributors. Maybe they had enough content, but the problem and why they killed it was that not enough people were going to the content. Like it wasn't driving traffic and driving revenue. So maybe they did successfully crowdsource it, but they didn't crowdsource the right information that would attract people. Either way, I think there's a huge trend right now towards adding an edit on GitHub button and trying to open up your docs. And I have not had success in that. And this just reinforced the fact that it's not a model that, I mean, maybe it works in a very few select rare communities where that's just the expected way people contribute and they're expected to contribute. So sure, then you have the open source infrastructure that allows them to edit on GitHub. But if those expectations aren't present, I am done trying to crowdsource information. I mean, I'm done putting that button on my docs. Every new technology that comes along and says, it's so easy, anybody can just easily contribute. You just click edit and voila. I'm like, yeah, tried that, done that. Doesn't work.
If it's more than one click.
I remember having very similar conversations about commenting. Like, when I used to work at Redgate, and we're like, oh, we're going to open up commenting, and we're going to have people like contributing their problems with this and adding their own information, and it just didn't work. You know, it sounds like it's going to be so good, and it just doesn't seem to fly.
I I
Yeah,
actually have
I
a
think we all
personal.
touched on a thing here.
But I
Point to
just
go,
actually
yep.
have a personal feeling that a lot of this, and reading between the lines, that a lot of it was more of a product decision based on some of the things that Tom said, and also one of the co-founders of Stack Overflow was in Berlin late last year, early this year, and I think a comparison between Stack Overflow and Wikipedia is actually quite an apt one, because they're both very, very popular sites that are not as staffed or as lucrative as you think. And I think they saw a problem that lots of people said was a big problem. So thought, oh, here's a way we can get more traffic and thus more revenue, because between you and me, I think they struggle for revenue because it's not a very obvious income stream in what they do. And they thought
No,
maybe
I wouldn't have no idea that you
Exactly.
could actually
And-
subscribe or donate to Stack
Well, it's
Overflow.
ads
Like,
to
I don't know what their
job
revenue
posting,
model.
basically. And I
I think they make
probably
most of their
thought-
money through
Yeah.
job adverts. I think that's actually their revenue stream. I think they get
Mostly.
people
Right.
the job adverts.
I think they hoped the increased by solving a big problem, they would have more views and more revenue. But it was a big problem that people always acknowledge as a problem, but don't necessarily look for a solution. I don't know.
Well, that post was quite honest in some ways, in that it was saying, this was just too expensive. Like they said, we could have put more people on it, and it wasn't worth the return on investment. And I think, in some ways, as tech writers, when we say, "Oh, well, this is why you should hire tech writers," but if you don't have the money to spend, then it's not an easy problem.
The thing I'd like to see about, from a product management perspective, is that they were quite open about what they learned from the whole experience of doing this documentation beta. And in big, bold font, they say, more importantly, we've changed our approach to product development across the company. And they basically, without reciting the article, what they've said is, we've actually gone outside the building. So what they were doing before is they were pretty much making product decisions internally, and with maybe a little bit of feedback from key members of the community, but certainly not a big enough cross-section of people. And changing that approach and trying to get more buy-in. It's you might go, well, yeah, okay, that's fine. This is actually a really common problem everywhere in business as far as product management goes. And I think sometimes even I'm fall victim to this as a product manager, where we don't actually get a big enough cross-section of user feedback. So it's good to see that they've had some lessons learned from it, and it looks like, rather than just documenting them in a retrospective, they're actually doing something about it, which will actually, it's going to save them heaps of money down the track, because by doing this and taking this approach and getting information earlier, like, actually asking technical writers perhaps about this. One of the things, I think it was Neil Kaplan on Twitter, said that while they released the thing last year, they didn't engage technical writers until May as the stakeholders. So that was, I think, a little bit more about the whole, getting the right people and the right users up front and actually asking the questions of them first. Would have been very interesting to see, if they had technical writers on board early, how this service would have been shaped and how it would have changed as the product moved forward and more people came on board. You just don't know, because they didn't do it like that. So you can't really tell, right? But it would have been interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. kind of baffling that what might have been. But it's, again, while I didn't use the service, I respect them a lot for doing it. And I think we all probably feel the same way there, that they gave it a crack. No one else is willing to give it a crack. And they got in there and just sort of tried something different, tried a new approach. And sometimes that's all it takes. In this case, they weren't successful, but who knows, if somebody tries to crowdsource again in a different way and removes practically all the barriers of contribution, which I think is a real thing, get it across the line to a point where people might do the occasional docs contribution here and there. on the internet.
I wonder,
So,
I wonder who might try this next. I mean, Stack Overflow, we're in such a good place to do this. I don't know if there are any other, organizations. Yes. Yeah, that's a good one.
Google has got the infrastructure and all that sort of stuff to do it. I think they would be, if they wanted to go down the rabbit hole and get into the world of documentation, they would have the infrastructure and vision and execution strategy that would be able to get them across the line with it. But again, this model from something that's a search engine to a content provider, and that's really not what they're about. So, they would have to divert the strategy, and they wouldn't do that because they know that that's a dangerous thing to do. But yeah, GitHub seems logical.
GitHub would be really interesting because they do things that are close to them. I mean, GitHub pages and things that are already kind of things that they're providing on top of repositories. It doesn't seem like a big jump for them.
Being so into the whole, Jekyll and, static sites and all that sort of stuff, I think you might have some ideas about, I know you said in the past, contribution by Box is just unheard of, but I just wonder the reason why. Is it the barrier of entry? Like, is creating, if I want to update a document on the internet and it's a GitHub back repo, is there just too many steps to jump through as a casual contributor to get into changing things? Like, what do you think? What do you think is the barrier of why it doesn't work?
Is this this is leading into our second topic,
it
right?
Very much is leading into the second topic, yeah.
This is my attempt at a segue, so enjoy.
Very cool. I worked a lot on some of the Jekyll documentation a few months back, and it is complicated to try to figure out the Git workflow. I mean, it seems like it'd be easy. Just click edit this page, and then you fork the repo in your own repository, and then you're like, well, then you clone it on your own machine, and then you make edits, and then you push your edits, and then you submit the pull request. But then things get complicated when they want you to make changes, and then you have other edits. I don't know. There's a lot there. That's when you go beyond just a simple little contribution becomes difficult. And I made the mistake early on of editing a few different documents, like maybe 6 or 7 in the same pull request, and people freaked out. They're like, you got to chunk this out, like 1 page per pull request, buddy. And because there was just too much there to see. So yeah, I think it is complicated, but more it's the time thing and the interest. Developers, they're into creating features and making functionality work, and there's this creative aspect to that that's fun. The documentation is more of like a brain dump. It's like something you do at the end, and it's not very fun. It's not creative, and I think people just don't want to do it because they don't like to do it. And you add the complexity on top of that, and then people do it poorly. And then you add on top of that that people often don't speak English as a first language, or they just don't have good writing skills. And yeah, it's a recipe for poor docs in open source.
So I think I work with quite a lot of developers who do want to contribute to docs, but I think there's definitely something, and I think this echoes what you said, that it's just it's much more effortful than you want it to be. Like, you kind of think, oh, I just want to fix this, and it's never that simple. And maybe that kind of perceived difference in how difficult it's going to be is one of the things that trips people up.
There is an element of that,
but
I think there's actually something else, and it's something I feel quite strongly about because I've stood in stand-ups with engineers and felt this feeling myself. It's like being the drummer in a band. Everyone knows you need to be there, but no one really wants to do it. And it's not as cool as being the singer or the guitarist. It's like writing features and writing code and adding all this stuff is cool. Writing the docs is like, there's a few crazy people who like doing it, but most of the time it's that thing you just kind of got to be there up the back keeping it going, and it's just not glamorous and it's not cool. And it's that's actually more fundamental and I've stood in stand-ups and things like that where it's like, I wrote this new feature, I did this, I optimized the code. What did you do, Chris? I wrote a tutorial. Oh, okay. Next week, you know. And,
but then it depends how much. I think the more interaction you have with the end users, the more that does become more interesting and more more visibly valuable. But I mean, so I work really I'm just starting to work a lot with our customer engineers, and with them it's like, oh, thank God you finally wrote that tutorial, or we've been waiting for these docs for ages, and that I think makes it, when there's that visible appreciation, it does make it more exciting. Maybe.
And then it leads into the problems that Tom discussed. They're the sorts of people that actually are more likely to want to contribute documentation, but then they don't have the understanding of a GitHub workflow and things like that. So,
But there's also this general the general trend that people vastly underestimate the work required to create good documentation. I think most people, when they think of writing docs, they put about the same effort as they would in typing an email. You'd be lucky if they even read it over once after they type it. And if you want to create good docs, I mean, you've got to triple check them, user test them, question all your assumptions, the versions, the platforms, the requirements. And really, if a developer has coded a feature, the person has probably exhausted a ton of energy into doing it. They could have stayed up late for weeks, and now they have to take on this additional task of writing docs. It's just too much, It's they just want to have a brain dump and move on. And I get that. I was re-architecting my team's Jekyll solution last 2 weeks, and after changing a bunch of stuff in code, I had to go and then document how people are going to use it, and just ran out of energy to do that well. I put little notes that said, this is rough and hasty, sorry.
To be confirmed.
So for those of you who have just tuned in, we're actually talking about in the fully executed on my part segue that I tried to do there. This is an article on the Next Web entitled "Free Software is Suffering Because Coders Don't Know How to Write Documentation." So we've already touched on some of the points that were raised in this article, and you'll be able to see that article in the show notes. But they basically say that in a recent survey, on an open source survey, incomplete or confusing documentation was, from the looks of the bar graph here, about 90% of the reason why problems encountered in open source, because documentation wasn't complete. And, that's hardly a surprise, as they say in the article. And we touched on the reasons why, because engineers like to work on the shiny. They don't like to, I guess, polishing things. And I think in some ways, documentation is polish, and also sales in a way too. Particularly on an open source project, that README that you see when you go to a new shiny framework, that can be the difference between people wanting to use your thing or not. So, it's it's a tough sell that,
I find it so weird because I don't understand the mentality at all of, oh, I've built this shiny new thing. Let's not tell anyone about it. I've built this.
I don't
great
for itself. It's self-documenting. It's fine. Everything's fine. Yeah, we don't need to actually write anything about it because, if they want to know, they won't look at the README. They'll just go straight into the source repo and start looking through that code.
They'll know this thing exists,
enjoyable.
Obviously.
Just download it, mate, and use it. It's fine.
I think one reason people actually start getting involved in an open source project is to create a feature that they want. The software lacks something that they want, so they create it. And after they've created it, then they have what they want. Adding the documentation is it doesn't fit into their incentive for why they got involved in the first place. They know how it works.
Yeah,
they created it.
Yeah, they know how it works, and it's right. It's scratched their itch. They've now got what they want. Good, and they just happen to be hosting it on GitHub. But that's because it's easier for them to then use their code that they want to use all the time, that they wrote and they know intimately about. They don't necessarily people use it or not. In a lot of cases, they go, this is for my benefit. Yeah. I'm fine with it. Yeah. And in a lot of cases, I've seen READMEs out there that are basically just minimum effective README, basically enough to initialize the repo, and that's it.
Then you're on your own.
There's a README there. It's like README and then 10 chars in the README, and that's all you need to get it to actually be valid. So, you know, it's a really good point, I think, actually, that, you know, sometimes open source projects that are on GitHub, they're just there because that's the easiest way to store them.
One thing that I can't quite understand about this article, by the way, got retweeted a ton of times. That's why I thought it would be good to discuss. Like, it's a very popular article. Here's the paradox. So many technical writers are trying to break into the field, new people who just graduate, or they are trying to transition into the field, and they're like, how do I break in? You know, and the constant advice is, why don't you go volunteer on an open source project? There are plenty, see this article, for example, that need better documentation. But tech writers, by and large, I don't think they're doing it. I mean, they're not really taking that as a transition step to break into the field. It's probably because it's like, you get in there and there isn't the information. It's hard to contact somebody. It's very difficult to sort of jump into deep water and swim successfully. But if you do want to break into the tech writing field, it seems like this is the perfect opportunity for you to, you know, do it.
Can I connect the last thing, or the last thing before that you said with what you just said? So here's an example of why I think we sometimes lose people on open source projects. Is that open source projects are often built by engineers, which is fine. Of course, that's the way it's going to be. I don't think anyone would want to see my code either, so it's fine. So I just started contributing to a fairly large open source project that did a call out for documentation, and I was looking for an open source project to get involved with, a kind of reasonably big one, so it seemed a perfect opportunity. And I thought, I'll go and do my first issue, and even in the contributing guide I found a problem. And it basically involved, actually, the community, and the head of the community is very approachable. I don't want to make any criticism of them, but it's a Node project. So you have to go through some fairly traditional steps starting with a Node project that anyone who's ever touched one would understand, but even that's a barrier. Then I got an error, and it was a Python error, which, firstly, anyone who's thinking,
in a Node project,
this is a JavaScript project, why am I getting a Python error? And all of these languages have these multiple versioning issues and things like that. And I'd had the same error in a different project the day before, so I knew what to do about it. And already I then said to the project lead, I had this problem. And they said, oh, you shouldn't have that problem. This is a JavaScript project. And I was like, well, I did. I knew why I did. And I knew what I was talking about. And we actually had the discussion, and he realized it was a problem. But, you know, I had a developer background, and I work with engineers all the time and know how to solve these things. But this is already on the contributing guide, I'd hit a roadblock. And if anyone is a technical writer without technical background, these are the sorts of things that trip you up. Things that to developers, like installing dependencies and things that are very second nature, to someone who's not done that can be very daunting, and you get these very odd error messages that make no sense to you. You have to start dealing with NVM and PyEnv and REnv and all these sorts of things that get extremely confusing very quickly. And I think that's
straight on the Slack Overflow.
Yeah.
Straight on the Slack Overflow.
Right.
What's going on with the error? So it's tough. And these are the sort of things I think that, you know, people from contributing, it's like, it's sort of, you got to go, well, I want to contribute to this project. I can't even do a thing on it because, as you say, contributing is broken and it doesn't have all the information in it. So
I don't have an answer to this problem either, I must say. But
well, it's like, and then you go, well, so you, as a technical writer who actually just wants to help for free, amount of work you need to put in to actually making a contribution in some respects, it just doesn't add up. Your time is actually more valuable than that. And so, for me, I remember when I was doing, at one point when I was moving out of Red Hat and deciding to sort of, open up my contribution history on GitHub, I decided to do a lot of ASCII documentation for ASCII Doctor. And I'll say this, even though, the project owner, Dan Allen, is really, really good as a community sort of engagement guy and everything, even as a technical writer submitting documentation to this project, there were some barriers that I had to overcome as a seasoned technical writer to get through it. And they were a turn-off to me to actually try and do this. And, you know, it opened up another discussion, you know, as, you know, a technical writer too, essentially the project owner who is understands what technical writing is all about. A way of, how do we improve this? Like, how do we actually make it easier to contribute? And I think the only way to do that is to relax your standards a little bit as a project owner, and accept a contribution and then expect that 80% of the work is done. But as the project owner, you're going to have to take it that next 20% and get it merged and say thank you very much to the person who actually did the 80% of the work, but don't expect them to actually the things that you want to have fixed. If you see things that are wrong, use that as your draft and then fix the rest, because someone's taken, it's a lot of the time, someone's taken so much time to get to that point. When you go and say, oh, look, I need you to change this, that's often enough for them to go, that MR is going to sit there and rot for a year because I've just spent so much time doing this and I don't have any more time to spend on it, but I just wanted to help you this far. And I know it's tough.
Sounds like we need an easy-to-use centralized platform to contribute documentation to. How about we work on that? That sounds like a good idea.
That's right.
Work.
Yeah. So, yeah.
I kind of have some.
Go ahead, Tom. I think
larger thoughts on just these overall trends. We've been talking a lot about like developers creating documentation solutions or integrating with developers in open source documentation solutions. And I think right now in the field of TechCom, we're seeing a huge shift towards developer documentation or doc as code workflows. I mean, first of all, people are collaborating through version control like Git. This is a huge paradigm. You no longer need like a central doc CMS where everybody checks in and out and everybody has a license and so forth. No, this collaboration in Git is huge. People are now building docs from the server because you've got a source control. So you have engineers who say, well, let's build it in our build management system and we're going to spit out the output. Whereas maybe in the past, tech writers would build on their local machines, create HTML and upload them somewhere. You know, that model is being pushed aside. You've got these markdown solutions that are becoming the norm, where you have a simple text format, no longer the XML type of or heavier markup solutions. And you've got all these open source tools, static site generators are becoming very, very common. So all of this is hugely transforming docs, and I think we're on the front end of this, or the front of this, and it's only going to be larger. You're going to see fewer documentation proprietary tools, fewer heavy documentation formats, fewer models where people have a giant CMS that they're checking into, and it's kind of exciting to be in the middle of this doc as code transformation, especially as the jobs also become more geared towards developer API type jobs. You know, the front end UI writer jobs are becoming less common as people get, you know, better user interfaces and more familiar. So that's kind of cool, and definitely I like the scene. I like being a part of something that's in the middle of a transformation that's changing.
So do you think we're talking about contributing because previously, like, contributing wasn't even possible, and now we're reaching a point where we've now got some tools that do actually allow us. We just haven't worked out how to do that well yet.
I think you probably nailed it there, Beth, actually. Like, we, as technical writers, we want people to be involved. And as Tom says, the tooling is nearly there. It's so close. But we just need to work out, probably as a writer, since we are the subject matter experts in how to contribute, we are probably the ones who need to go and put our thinking caps on and go, right, what as a casual user would I want to experience with documentation, and then turn that into either issues or you know, some sort of roadmap that someone can consume and then implement. Because, you know, really I think that's the missing piece that we probably all cotton onto here. We probably need to start driving what we want as contribution, as technical writers.
So one of the things I've been trying out a bit at work, so like, because I work with a lot, like I couldn't do my job if our developers didn't contribute to our docs. There's just way too much to do. And a lot of like the best ways of working that we've ended up doing have been a lot of sit down at the start, work out what it is that needs to get done. And then once you get that out, it's actually quite easy to just say, okay, well, I need to fill in this, this, and this, and put an example here. And that seems to work pretty well as a work out the broad structure and then get it done.
Fill in the gaps. Yeah, I think we have touched on in the past how templates can help contributors to just do basic docs. And sometimes that's all it's needed, because once a basic framework's there, then other contributions can flow onto that with pull requests and minor changes. And, I think when it's stored in a VCS, it becomes living. And, anyone can commit to it and change it. So therefore, even if the change is wrong, or scare quotes wrong, it's an opportunity for dialogue, and it's an opportunity to open up a discussion about why they thought that was the way it is. And I think that's often more effective than saying, oh, raise a bug, put your feedback in a bug, and then, at some point we'll do it, which I've been for a long time, that's been how documentation worked. But I think the VCS approach and, GitHub and all that sort of stuff, it's all about, well, it comes down to community in a sense, but that community can take different forms. It can be a developer community inside your organization, or it can be the public contributing, or it can be a combination of the two. But it's all about opening up the dialogue and then talking about it. And that actually takes a lot of effort to actually do that. That actually is really like not really an architect role, but that's more a curator role, someone that's there always watching and listening and helping. Yeah. Distance.
You're still on your coffee. We're winding down. You're waking up.
Yeah, I've only had one coffee. I've only had one coffee. I think I need more. That'll calm me down a little bit. Actually, speaking of calming down, we should probably think about dovetailing all this, because it's getting towards start of work day for me, and I'm probably pretty sure for Beth and Chris probably about beddy by his time. Time for bed. All right. So have we got any closing thoughts, or have we already done that? I'm not sure. I think we've been closing thoughts for the last 15 minutes, really. But yeah.
Actually, I mean, for any of the kind of, I've been thinking about a couple of things recently, that trends in developer areas that I wouldn't mind getting people's feedback on how documentation could fit into them. And one is, one especially that I'm about to write an article, and I'd like feedback from anyone who's interested in this sort of stuff. There's this whole kind of trend in developer APIs with GraphQL, and people saying that it, again, solves some documentation problems. And I'd like to really hear from any experienced developers or writers working in that about how does it change how you document things. I haven't looked into it in great detail yet, because I've got a little bit of time to write the article, but I'd be interested to hear anyone with experiences in working with GraphQL.
How should they contact you?
Slack.
Have you got, should they contact you to help you out with that?
Shout. I don't know. You can find me.
Carrier pigeon.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Cool. Well, we'll put links. Well, we've got a lot of social contacts on the website anyhow, so definitely do help out Chris if you've got knowledge in that area. That'll be really good. And also, if you want to talk more about the things that we've talked about today in the podcast, then start up a conversation. You can do that on Slack. Is write the docs slack.com, and you can find out how to connect to that if you're new to the show in the show notes. You can also send us an old school email if you want. Again, links to that are in the show notes. If you want to go more long form, remember Slack is temporal, so you can also create a forum post as well, and that will persist your discussion a little bit longer than Slack, because we've got a top level limit on Slack in its messages, and things disappear quickly. So yeah, thanks again for listening and tuning in today, and listening to all of us talk about the very varied reasons why contributions can work. And thank you very much for staying up late, Beth, and joining us today. It's been really great having you on the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thanks.
You're most welcome. And to Chris for organising Beth and introducing her to us. That's been great. And thanks again also for staying up and contributing today, and to Tom for joining and contributing today as well. So I think we'll leave it there for now. Thank you for listening, and remember, docs or it didn't happen.